There is one fact about today's Trump-Xi meeting in Beijing that nobody in mainstream financial media leads with. Trump flew to Beijing, not Xi to Washington, not to Geneva, not to Singapore, not the G20 somewhere. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, boarded Air Force One, flew 13 hours to Beijing and is now sitting in the Great Hall of the People asking Xi Jinping to extend a trade truce. And the markets treat this as a victory. S&P futures were up 0.4%. Analysts are calling this meeting a tactical catalyst. Goldman Sachs issued a note last night saying this event can be a meaningful positive for China assets. CNBC anchors are covering the state dinner as a new restaurant opening they have been waiting to check out. The mood is constructive, optimistic. The word stabilization is used everywhere. But what is stable? Relative to what baseline? Because if you look at actual terms of this trade relationship, what U.S. tariffs on China are, what Chinese tariffs on the U.S. are, how the trade between those two countries developed during the past 3 years, what the Supreme Court ruling on U.S. tariff authority was in February, and what's going to happen on November 10th, the picture you'll see is completely different from what the markets are pricing today. So let me take you back to April 2025. Liberation Day. Trump administration introduced the biggest restructuring of the U.S. trade policy in 75 years, sweeping tariffs on the main trading partners. On China, they introduced tariffs that pushed average U.S. duty on Chinese goods to 47.5%, from the previous 3.1% pre-Trump's first term. The goal was very clear: to force China to negotiate with the U.S. on America's terms, to push the cost of entering the American market to such a level that there would be no other way for Beijing than to accept the terms of change in its economic structure: subsidies, intellectual property rights, technology transfer, currency manipulation, etc. What China did. First, they retaliated with tariffs on agriculture, then on rare earth exports, then on semiconductor manufacturing materials, then on magnet exports, dual-use goods, and then finally in October 2025, China took what was considered the most serious action so far. China imposed a sweeping export control of rare earth elements, using the very same foreign direct product rule that Trump administration used against Chinese chip manufacturers. Automakers from Germany, US, and India started to warn of production line closures. Chipmakers talked about early-stage disruptions. According to analysts at CSIS, Chinese rare earth export controls are the most consequential measures targeting US defense and technology industries. Why? Because China controls approximately 90% of global rare earth processing capacity. Not 90% of reserves. The US has considerable rare earth reserves, but 90% of processing capacity of rare earth ore to finished materials, materials that are necessary for every modern semiconductor chip, every F-35 fighter, every Virginia-class submarine, every AI chip produced by Nvidia, every electric vehicle motor, every lithography machines that produce those semiconductors, neodymium that is inside magnets used in your phone, dysprosium that allows keeping those magnets working in heat of a data center, yttrium oxide that serves as a coating and plasma etch process in TSMC facilities that produce those chips, rare earth alloys in semiconductor fabrication equipment that Jensen Huang's supply chain needs, almost everything that goes through China processing capacity, that in October 2025 China put under license requirement. Then something happened that almost nobody paid as much attention as they should. In November 2025, Trump flew to Busan, South Korea, to meet with Xi Jinping, not Beijing, neutral territory, South Korea. And out of this meeting, they made the deal that markets love: a year-long suspension of Chinese rare earth export controls. 90-day tariff truce. Purchase commitments on the Chinese side. Tariffs reduction on both sides. February 2026. Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the President of the United States to impose tariffs. Legal foundation of Trump's entire tariff regime fell unconstitutional. The Trump administration tried to implement workarounds for it, but it still seriously damaged their negotiating position. Here we are, May 14, 2026. Trump is in Beijing with Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang, Larry Fink, and the CEO of Boeing. And the suspension of Chinese rare earth export controls, the measure which prevented materials shock in the semiconductor fabrication industry, the global AI build-out, and the defense industry, expires on November 10, 2026. 6 months from now. This expiration date is the real agenda of this meeting. Everything else is theater. What Trump needs from this meeting. He needs China to either prolong their rare earth suspension agreement beyond November or sign more permanent framework eliminating the threat of a materials cutoff. Without this, the $86 billion semiconductor rally that just happened in the past 6 weeks with Nvidia's, Micron, AMD's, and even Intel's massive year-to-date gain is sitting on top of a supply chain that goes through the country he is currently visiting with hat in hand. Or rather, Jensen Huang is in Beijing in his presidential delegation to negotiate with the country controlling the rare earth materials needed for semiconductors. So let me ask you, why do you think Jensen Huang came to Beijing? Not because the relationship with China is good, quite the contrary, and not because the owners of Nvidia don't understand that the rare earth material disruption is not something minor, it's a load-bearing wall. And let me show you the numbers on the damage done by this trade war, because understanding what it's costing America helps us understand what Trump is negotiating in Beijing much better. Two-way goods trade between the US and China in 2022 amounted to $690 billion. In 2025, it was estimated at approximately $415 billion. That's a decrease in bilateral trade volume by $275 billion in 3 years, or if you translate it into percentage terms, 40% decrease in goods flow between the two largest economies in the world. However, this decline in the volume of trade is not distributed equally. Peterson Institute for International Economics, not a partisan institution, the most respected trade organization in the world, tracked what happened with import prices on U.S. market. A significant part of tariffs costs was absorbed by Americans, raising prices on certain products. While the current CPI and PPI inflation is fueled not only by tariff but also by oil shocks, import categories that suffered from tariffs increase were elevated. Apparel category, electronics, household goods, industrial goods. These are categories that contain imported goods manufactured in China that when you impose 47.5% tariff on, the U.S. consumers pay it. On the Chinese side, the export machine adapted. Southeast Asia became a new transit hub for goods that went to U.S. market through Chinese factories. Vietnamese and Mexican factories producing Chinese components shipped their products to the U.S. market and technically complied with tariff law because the final assembly happened outside China. Friendshoring, that the tariff regime wanted to incentivize, created in fact a more complicated supply chain with more intermediary steps while starting from Chinese goods. The wall had doors and the Chinese exporters found them. In this context, consider a view of Scott Kennedy at CSIS, one of the senior China economy analysts, who pointed out that China's approach to negotiations prior to this meeting had become significantly more confident than in 2017 when Donald Trump's first term started. As he said, in 2017, China feared even minor changes in U.S. tariffs. By 2026, according to Kennedy, Xi had been able to push back and neutralize much of Trump's actions. The numbers back this point. China retaliated to the Liberation Day tariffs immediately, essentially matching the U.S. escalation point for point, and used the rare earths weapon in a way showing that it did not hesitate to suffer economic losses at home to maintain leverage. And lastly, one must consider the geopolitical aspect that tends to blur the picture in trade relations. Firstly, Xi's message to Trump at the beginning of the summit, conveyed through the official Chinese readouts, which were diplomatically worded yet clearly implied, stated that Taiwan is the most important issue in China-U.S. relations, adding that its mishandling would put the relationship in great jeopardy. Phrased in diplomatic language, this is not a compliment. It is a statement of boundaries, delivered in the context of a summit where Trump needed something from China. Sequencing matters, which is exactly what Xi showed. By establishing his leverage on an existential question first, he set the terms for the subsequent commercial discussion. Secondly, from China's perspective, the structure of this summit, where the U.S. president flies to Beijing, brings along his top technology executives, and asks for an extension of a materials freeze that China controls, is exactly the structure Beijing sought to establish. Chinese foreign ministry and state-controlled media characterize the U.S. president's visit as a recognition of China's enhanced global position. The phrase they use internally is "coming to us," which, in reality, describes precisely what happened. However, none of this suggests that the summit will fail. Based on the preliminary information, the two countries seem to agree on language like constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability, as well as on overall balanced and positive outcomes. Trump declared that China will buy 200 Boeing planes, increasing imports of U.S. oil and agricultural products. Tariff truce seems likely to be extended. Rare earth suspension is likely to continue until at least November 10th. The tactical catalyst market thesis seems to be spot on in the near-term perspective. Indeed, the summit seems likely to deliver sufficiently positive-sounding results to drive a new equity rally, especially in US-based firms with China exposure. There is, however, a difference between a tactical catalyst and a structural resolution of the dispute. The financial media's tendency to present one as the other leads many traders into positions they do not truly understand. Let me outline what exactly has been developed in the past year. First, U.S. tariff system is legally weakened following the Supreme Court's ruling on IEEPA. Average Chinese import tariffs at 47.5% are economically painful to both sides but did not result in the restructuring of China's economy. Second, China's rare earth leverage, suspended until November 10th of this year, is a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. Third, the U.S. has no alternative source for rare earth material processing at scale. U.S. domestic production grew by over 400% in 2024, yet still brought reliance on imports down from 95% to 80%. Fourth, the artificial intelligence build-out currently fueling the most impressive stock market rally ever requires Chinese processed rare earths as well as Chinese demand for AI-enabled chips because the US-based hyperscalers building AI infrastructure need Chinese contracts selling AI services and chips into the local market. In this context, Jensen Huang's presence at the Beijing summit stems not only from his company's need for Chinese rare earths to produce chips, but also from Nvidia's need to sell its chips in China. The current trade relationship is not merely competitive, it is highly symbiotic in a way that constrains both parties' aggressive actions. They both know this, and both parties know how to exploit this dynamic in the talks. Which brings us to the ironic twist of the current summit that the market seems to celebrate. The summit is taking place precisely because the US-China trade war resulted in hostage-taking situation. China needs access to U.S. semiconductors for its technology development, whereas the U.S. needs access to rare earth processing for its semiconductor and defense industries. Both parties placed export controls. Both parties paused them. Now both sides are sitting in Beijing trying to agree on extending their pause and discussing other matters of concern to both sides, including the Iran war, where China refuses to compel Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. While this summit may bring a constructive relationship of strategic stability, this is not a resolution of the ongoing tensions over Taiwan, China's technological leadership, global reserve currency status, the Iran war, and China's stance toward Tehran. This is an agreement to manage these tensions quietly. While this does not necessarily constitute a bad situation, indeed, managed competition is much better than a destructive conflict. This is not a resolution, as the market assumes right now. Thus, this is the specific risk of November 10, 2026. If China chooses not to extend its rare earth material suspension or extends it for only a limited period, then a countdown on the single most important decision in the semiconductor industry begins. Corporations will have to choose between paying higher prices for other rare earth materials or lobbying hard for another rare earths deal before the deadline expires. In either scenario, the cost structure of AI chips will receive additional risks that are difficult to absorb when the stock is valued with no uncertainties whatsoever. A mere 10% spike in rare earth inputs is not likely to mean a 10% decline in corporate earnings. But such increase can certainly disrupt forward guidance, something multiple valued stocks cannot afford. On the other hand, if this Beijing summit manages to extend the rare earth suspension for another year, it will eliminate a particular risk. Yet it will not resolve the underlying geopolitical competition in any shape or form. Instead, it will postpone it until 2027, when U.S. midterm dynamics will shift, IEEPA situation will have further developed, and AI build-out will have made China and the U.S. even more interdependent. And here comes the bullish hypothesis, since this channel tries to provide objective analysis. This optimistic scenario presumes that the current managed competition is the most probable long-term equilibrium. This scenario states that the rare earth issue gets resolved, although not immediately, with a combination of diplomatic extension, continued increase in domestic production of rare earths, and diversified procurement from Australia, Canada, Brazil, and Greenland. Consequently, the rare earth issue will lose most of its significance for the AI build-out and global semiconductor industry by 2028. The presence of U.S. business delegations at this summit will prove beneficial in terms of stabilizing the bilateral relationship because of the high amount of economic interest involved. The stabilization mentioned above will turn into a new type of equilibrium on which both supply chains and financial markets will be able to rely on. This scenario is quite plausible. World's two largest economies simply have too much economic interest in avoiding a complete decoupling. Pain of this decoupling would be so great that the corresponding incentives to carefully manage bilateral relations will arise on both ends. However, the gap between having incentives and resolution is huge. At this moment, markets are pricing today's Beijing summit as if it is a solution rather than an opportunity to gain some time. Future rally in futures, enthusiasm in the tech industry, tactical catalyst approach, all of this treats the handshake as if it closed the book, while it did not even open it yet. What this Beijing summit achieved is 6 to 12 months of breathing space to keep the competition going. Buying time is not solving a problem, and here is what I want to ask you in the comments section, because this is one of those situations when the same facts may suggest two opposite conclusions. Are you seeing Beijing summit as a true diplomatic breakthrough, with the competition being managed effectively, rare earths issue solved, and Beijing summit becoming the beginning of multi-year diplomatic engagement period? Comment, it's a deal. Or are you seeing today's meeting as a positive step in optics, despite the geopolitical tensions over Taiwan, rare earths, technological leadership, and China's Iran war refusal remaining completely unresolved and the market pricing this 6-month truce as if it were a 10-year resolution? Comment, bought time, not solved. Finally, are you seeing China as having won the leverage game over the last year and making the US come to Beijing thanks to its rare earths leverage? Are you sure that this Beijing summit is going to set new terms for US-China relations that Washington will agree to accept? Comment, China won. This is because the markets will rise due to today's headlines. This is very likely true. However, after 12 months, when the November 10th deadline for rare earths has either been prolonged, reached, or superseded, we will find out which one of these statements was correct. Trump is in Beijing, and Xi is the host. Meanwhile, the $39 trillion debt clock, the 3.8% inflation reading, the rejection of interest rate reductions in bonds, and the November rare earth deadline are all waiting outside the banquet hall for the party to end. History does not reveal itself instantly, it simply makes the preparations.